Hello again. Great to be back with you. I hope you're safe and doing well here as we continue our quarantine story time for our seniors and area retirement homes and everyone else throughout the Northwoods and beyond who are social distancing and helping others and saving lives by just locking the doors and closing things up. Enjoying the book greatly as we continue. David Maraniss' When Pride Still Mattered, A Life of Vince Lombardi. He has advanced to recap a little bit. He had left his alma mater, Fordham, who didn't treat him particularly well when he went to coach there, just made him an assistant and then kind of kept somebody else in there, the head coach, who clearly didn't deserve it. Well, he went on to, Lombardi did, to coach the offensive line at Army, and he finds a real role model there in the head coach, Red Blake, a bit of a legend at Army at that time. And so now it is Army versus Fordham, his old alma mater, and it is a grudge match game. His old players don't want people to think that their success was all due to Lombardi, and Lombardi obviously wants revenge on Fordham. Army destroys Fordham in that big-time game. And not only that, it is just like one brawl after another. You get people with teeth knocked out all over the field. People think that there are cheap shots. They think that Army took some cheap shots as well, which Lombardi takes some offense to. So we join the post-game carnage at the end talking about it. One sports writer acknowledged that he enjoyed the melee. Quote, "I hope there will be no hollering, bellowing, nor deploring over the Army-Fordham game. After all, boys will be boys." End quote. The boys will be boys is in all caps, by the way. Frank Graham wrote in his game column for the New York Sun, but the brotherly feud was not dismissed so easily by the antagonists. Even Lombardi and Cohane, Tim Cohane, his old classmate and now a sports reporter, found themselves in a shouting match afterwards over who started the mess. At a post-game dinner at Coach Blake's house, Cohane chided Lombardi and said Army precipitated the fighting. Lombardi said his alma mater was responsible. Blake, as Cohane recalled it, quote, adopted the attitude of one who had been treated contemptuously by an old friend. But in the end, Lombardi took a lasting lesson from that game that had nothing to do with the fighting. For the rest of his career, he would remember how Fordham reacted late in the second quarter when it was trailing 7-0. Quote, "Fordham panicked," Lombardi said years later. Twice in a row, the Rams tried to score quickly with passes and were intercepted both times, leading to quick Army scores. Instead of trailing by 7 points at halftime, they faced an insurmountable 3-touchdown disadvantage. Quote, "I never forgot this," Lombardi said. From then on, whenever a quarterback pleaded for a last-minute touchdown strike before the half, Lombardi said no, remembering Fordham's 1949 collapse at Michie Stadium. The season ended perfectly for Army with a 38-0 thrashing of Navy, and Blake's maligned but victorious squad won the Lambert Trophy as the best team in the East. After 2 glum losing years on Rose Hill, Lombardi was feeling the thrill of work and play again. At the postseason luncheon honoring the team, Red Blake seemed untroubled by the controversy that had stalked him all year. He confessed that before the season begun he had thought about retiring, but now he was glad he'd stayed. Quote, "You have to pay the price," was his favorite motto, and he felt that he and his team had done so and were now reaping the reward. Quote, "Once in a while you're lucky enough to have the thrill and satisfaction of working with a group of men who are willing to make every sacrifice to achieve a goal and then experience the achieving of it with them," Blake said. "In this, believe me, there is a payment that cannot be matched in any other pursuits." Duty, honor, country, football. What about family? The Lombardis were given a house at 1101 Bartlett Loop on the Academy Post, a cul-de-sac known informally as Coach's Loop. Most of the staff lived there, including the effervescent Red Reader, who had a son about the same age as the Lombardi boy, and 3 daughters with whom young Vincent was infatuated. West Point was so different from Englewood, that was back in his old coaching post in New Jersey. Exotic and contradictory, rules about everything, and yet wild and free, with a foreboding sense of danger and mortality. World War II was 4 years distant by this time the Lombardis arrived, but lingered in the culture. Most of the officers, like Red Reader, had fought the Nazis in Europe. Their wives had been transformed by enduring 4 years on the post alone. They were accustomed to running the house without men. The kids tended to be independent, if not forgotten. Quote, "We probably fought a bit more than other kids," recalled Russell Reader III, who was 9 years old when young Vincent moved in down the street and became his first West Point pal. Quote, "We probably had less support from our parents. It was an awkward place, but a wonderful place at the same time." Most wondrous was the sense of freedom. Quote, "Maybe it was the times or maybe the community, but you could go anywhere and do anything," remembered Russell's sister Julia. Hide and seek up at Fort Put, sardines in the cadet chapel, swimming in the academy pool, tennis courts. Young Vincent rode his bike everywhere and always found something to watch. Cadets marching across the plain, the football team practicing on the nearby field, a baseball game, Colonel Reader, the assistant coach, hitting fungos on a prosthetic leg, hurdlers scraping by at a track meet. Once, young Vincent walked into the officers' club and ordered a hamburger and milkshake and put it on the old man's tab. This life, he thought, was, quote, "an ideal deal," until his father examined the monthly bill, that is, and quickly put a stop to the freeloading. "Geez," Vincent said decades later, remembering the scene, quote, "he'd like to have taken my head off." By the time young Vincent entered 3rd grade, some of the roughness of the place had rubbed off on him. Wanting to be considered one of the guys, he became a goof-off in school, and one day was ordered from his seat in the back of the class to sit in confinement in the well under the teacher's desk. At recess, he made his escape and walked off the school property unnoticed. His teacher reported him missing when the class returned inside. School officials called Marie at home and Vince at the gymnasium. The post was mobilized to find Coach Lombardi's son. Had he been kidnapped? Students who could recognize him were taken out of class to help MPs comb the grounds. For hours, as the frantic search continued into surrounding woods, young Vincent sat hidden from view in the back of an abandoned building near their house on the Loop, unaware of the commotion, taking in the sun, chewing on a stalk of grass. Near the end of the day, he got to his feet and walked over to his house and calmly said hello to his little sister and frantic mother. It was never easy being the namesake son of Vince Lombardi. That childhood moment of rebellion came to symbolize young Vincent's lifelong dilemma, trying to find his own quiet place in the sun. To say that Lombardi was a strict father at West Point would be accurate and misleading. He had no qualms about hitting his son as punishment for apparent wrongdoing. The backhand thwacks of his mother, Mattie, imprinted on his brain as an effective means of discipline. But mostly Lombardi was missing. He was largely an absentee father and husband, when not physically, then emotionally. At work from 8 in the morning until late in the night, away on road trips with the team or recruiting prospective cadets in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Wisconsin. He found himself trapped in the snowdrifts of Green Bay on a recruiting mission with Doug Kenna and muttered, quote, "Can you imagine living in this godforsaken place?" When he did spend an evening at home, it often seemed to his family that he was not there, especially during spring drills, fall practice, and the regular season, half of every year. The dining room was his extra office, strewn with papers thick with smoke, 2 ashtrays crammed with cigarette butts before the night was out, 3 packs a day, 4 cartons a week, as he diagrammed plays and planned what he would tell his troops the next day. 10 years into their marriage, even after all those years at Saints and Fordham, Marie was still uncertain about her place in Vince's football life. She desperately sought more of his time and attention and alternately loved and hated the game that possessed him, now embracing it as the most effective means of reaching Vince, now rejecting it roundly as the temptress that lured her husband away from her. She often strolled down to the practice field to watch Vince lead the cadets through drills. The practices were open to the public, and many wives and professors came out to see them. Blake, by nature a secretive man, never liked the tradition and largely ignored the well-wishers. Lombardi was more gregarious, though not with Marie. Once she returned from a trip to Manhattan with Doug Kenna's wife wearing a tight new knit suit and was delighted with her thin and striking appearance until Vince looked over at her and ruined her mood, shouting loud enough for heads to turn, quote, "God, Marie, you look like a sausage." If Marie was embarrassed, she did not take this abuse meekly. Quote, "She just leveled him, I mean totally leveled him, with words," said Doug Kenna, who had been standing next to Vince on the field. Marie yearned for social standing. She wanted to be accepted by the elite and appreciated that West Point was a notch up the social ladder from Englewood. With other football wives, she made periodic trips to Manhattan, where they shopped on Fifth Avenue and dined at Leone's on West 48th Street, the boisterous Italian restaurant run by Gene Leone, who was Army fan number 2, if General MacArthur was number 1. Leone, whose son-in-law was a popular major at West Point, had been made an honorary member of the class of 1915, Eisenhower's class. He bought a nearby estate, catered at least one gourmet meal a year to the gang at Bull Pond, and made his restaurant the New York headquarters for all West Point officers and football coaches. Their wives were golden at Leone's, free parking in the lot, best tables, and service. Marie enjoyed the special attention, but just as in Englewood, her Manhattan interludes could not fill the void. Nor could her children. She spent more time with young Vincent and Susan than Vince did, but she was not a doting mother. Rearing children was largely a distraction to her. She wanted to be with Vince and adults. It was the talk of the post once when little Susie wandered off unnoticed by her mother until a minister called and said he had found the toddler stark, naked, and crying inside his church. Marie's drinking worsened at West Point. She attended several Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and sought other counseling to help her deal with her frustrations of married life. Quote, "A lot of Army wives used to drink too much. They'd have these coffee clatches or liquor clatches in the early afternoons," said Vince's middle brother Harold, who had long been Marie's confidant. Quote, "A lot of Marie's drinking came because she idolized Vin, and he was off with his own little group." Marie spent many hours over at the Reeder house, unloading her problems on Reeder's wife, Dort. Daughter Julia Reeder would eavesdrop. One day she heard Marie say, quote, "Dort, I figured it out. He really is easy to live with, as long as he is not thinking about football," which meant not often enough. When Vince was in a loving mood, sometimes his timing was off. Once at a tea for Army Athletic Association wives, Marie confessed that her husband was always in a rush. Quote, "Last week he came home from the football office at 11 a.m. when I was baking a cake. He wanted to make love to me, and I got flour all over the both of us." For the most part, the outside world knew little of this. Vince and Marie were considered a fun-loving couple. In social settings, Lombardi was almost universally regarded as warm and jovial. Margaret Cohane, Tim's wife, considered him, quote, "very much a man's man who paid little attention to the women in a room, but even she was taken by his enthusiasm, especially, quote, that wonderful laugh that would start way down low and then expand." Vince was the godfather of the Cohanes' third child, Mary Therese. He seemed especially friendly with children other than his own. During the summer months, families in the athletic departments got together for ice cream socials with 5-cent movies and badminton tournaments, and Uncle Vince was always right there playing with the kids. Of course, he could not just hit the shuttlecock back and forth. Quote, "If he was going to play, it had to be a competition, a real game," said Russell Reeder, but his good-natured participation was appreciated nonetheless. When Doug Kenna's wife came to football practice with their 6-month-old daughter, Vince, quote, "made a beeline to her and started dancing around the practice field singing, 'Toot toot tootsie, goodbye, toot toot tootsie, don't cry.' The Kenna girl was known by her family as Tootsie for the rest of her life." Lombardi certainly had strong feelings for family. Maddie and Harry drove up from Englewood, his parents, every few weeks. Old 5x5 hauling a few thick, delicious fillets from the meat market, and various Izzo cousins were also frequent guests. Izzo is his mother's side of the family, Vince's. Jim Lawler, his roommate from Fordham, and several Englewood friends often dropped in. One of young Vince's strongest memories of West Point was of his father and Tim Cohane sitting on the couch in the living room late at night, quote, talking and talking and talking. Tim did most of the talking. He was probably the forerunner of Howard Cosell, one of those guys who always had an opinion, and it sounded better by virtue of the way he delivered it, with his deep, authoritative, melodious voice. Vince and Susan were sometimes puzzled by how talkative their father could be with other people, how cuddly he was with other kids, in contrast to the way he was at home. He was not the same person with them that he was with his players and friends. There were times when the wife and kids wondered they were at fault, somehow not living up to the concept of family that Vince carried with him from his childhood in Sheepshead Bay. The 50s, nothing placid about the way the new decade began at West Point. By the end of June 1950, America was at war again, and many of the cadets who had played on the fields of friendly strife were now on muddy fields in Korea, led by General MacArthur, Supreme Commander, Allied Powers, Commander of United Nations military forces fighting the North Koreans and Communist Chinese. At the Academy casualty lists were posted weekly, many of the names all too familiar to the cadets. As the football season opened in September, word arrived of the combat death of Tom Lombardo, captain of the 1944 national championship team. The players were distracted by events in Korea from then on. As part of his hazing duties as a plebe that year, Lowell Sisson, a tenderfoot's end from Waterloo, Iowa, had to report to an upperclassman's room every day before meal formation, where he stood, quote, in stiff brace at the doorway and summarized all the dispatches from Korea in that morning's New York Times. Quote, all the seniors knew they might be over there in a few months, Sisson recalled. It was a very tense time for them. Even in that anxious state of mind, the football team began the season performing better than it had the year before. Lombardi, whom Blake had entrusted with the cadet offense, devoted himself to the development of the coach's son, Bob Blake, Galifa's replacement at quarterback, and the effort paid off. Bob became the leader of a team that routed Michigan again and shut out 5 teams as it rolled through the first 7 games undefeated. For the 8th game, Army took its first road trip by air out to California to play Stanford. It had rained unceasingly in Northern California, and the game was played in a blinding downpour, the field all mud and muck. Bob Blake passed for the lone touchdown. That night, after the 7-0 Army victory, the old man and Lombardi and the rest of the staff partied in Blake's suites at the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco. Tim Cohane was there, along with the aging Granny Rice and a coterie of Eastern writers. They told stories and recited corny epic poems late into the night, Blake and his men exhilarated by what was now a 28-game unbeaten streak. The overconfident cadets had 2 weeks to prepare for the game against Navy, the traditional season-ending rivalry. Scouting reports on the midshipmen had been coming in all year, and they were invariably encouraging. Navy was becalmed, going nowhere in a miserable losing season. All prognostications were of an imminent rout. Blake was nervous, as always, against Navy. The game could ruin an otherwise glorious season. Quote, there was tension among the coaches, Lombardi said later, but, quote, Blake hid the tension from the players. He was nervous, feeling that his players were losing their feel of the game because heavy rains had forced them to practice indoors. Then, a few days before the game, during what was called Navy Week, when Corps enthusiasm usually reached a feverish pitch, a report came in that Johnny Trent was dead, killed in action earlier that month in Korea. Trent had been the captain of the 1949 team, an ebullient end from Memphis who had begun the year as a graduate assistant working with the plebes squad before he and classmate Arnold Galifa, the quarterback, were sent across the Pacific with the Third Army. The, quote, ever-increasing sad news from Korea, which has been brought closer to the cadets than to any group in the land, Blake said, had relegated thoughts of the Navy game to second place. Perhaps they were excuses. The Navy team, which had received brilliant scouting reports on Army and played flawlessly, might have won anyway that day, and when they did, 14-2. There was a touch of poetic justice to the upset. Army was beaten at its own strong-arm game. Quote, the Navy beat us, and beat is the proper word, as our men took a physical beating which completely bewildered them, Blake wrote later in a long letter to MacArthur. Gilbert Reich, our only safety, went out the first 5 minutes of play and did not clear mentally until late Saturday night. Ordinarily, we use 3 or 4 ammonia inhalers during a game, but against Navy, our trainers used 4 dozen boxes. With Reich out, the only long pass for a score, which had been made against the Cadets in several years, was completed. It was the play that gave Navy a surge, which could not be denied. It is doubtful that Blake's lament moved MacArthur much in this instance, for at the same time that Army was losing to Navy, MacArthur's United Nations forces were at the Yalu River in Korea suffering a loss of incomparably greater dimensions. MacArthur, convinced that the Red Chinese would not enter the war, or if they did, that it would be without much firepower, had pushed his troops to the Korea-China border. He ended up leading his men into a trap, and 3,000 soldiers from the 2nd Infantry Division were killed or wounded as they retreated south through a gauntlet of Red Chinese guns firing down into a valley clogged with abandoned vehicles and the bloody detritus of war. Hardly in the same realm as Blake's 4 dozen boxes of ammonia inhalers in the Navy game. If there was a comparison to be made, it was that both the coach and his favorite general were victims of their own success. On the Special Academy train returning to West Point from the Army-Navy game in Philadelphia, Blake entered a compartment shared by his assistants, Lombardi, Warmath, and Kenna. He appeared utterly disconsolate. Quote, "I want to talk to you," he said in a deep, low voice. To Lombardi and Warmath's relief, he was looking at Kenna. Kenna knew that he was in trouble. He was in charge of the defensive backs, and they had been beaten on some key plays. Quote, "I thought he was going to chew me out, but he really didn't. He explained it was my fault, but that was that. He was in agony and wanted to talk to somebody. I sat and listened to him all the way back to West Point," Kenna said later. Quote, "I don't think Blake ever lost a game that hurt that much." In his letter to MacArthur explaining the loss, Blake acknowledged the depth of his despair. Quote, "There are many who had said that it is well that a friendly series such as ours should be more even, but I confess that there is no philosophy in me that accepts such a theory. We got the heck kicked out of us, and there is much to be done at West Point before we can get into the win column. More, much more, than Blake then realized." Ooh, that is ominous. Maraniss, you devil. That was good foreshadowing, and we're out of time for our talk for today. Up next, Chapter 7, Blake's Boys. It'll be coming your way tomorrow. Again, thank you to all of our healthcare workers who are working so tirelessly with, not enough equipment at hand to take care of the job. Also, we're speaking directly to you folks in our area nursing homes, and we hope you're well, and we're thankful for caregivers there, for the nurses, for all the staff, cooks, and everyone else who are pitching in as of right now and keeping you comfortable. So we'll be back again tomorrow. Be well, stay safe. Thanks for being with us.